Thank you for the introduction, Travis. As he said, I'm the editor-in-chief for the Nordic APIs blog, and I think it's been 4 years I've been doing this now, working with the community to spread the knowledge of APIs, and it's been a real honor to do so. For the last 4 summits, they've also asked me to come and keynote, and before we do each summit, there's a lot of planning that goes on. And before the summit, my colleagues at Nordic APIs, they'll come to me, they'll be like, Bill, we need some sort of theme, we need a tagline for this event. You know, something that can just describe an entire year for an entire industry with a couple words. You know, no pressure at all, should be very easy. So for this one, I was just like, okay, how about continuous API strategies for integrated platforms? And I guess they bought it because they liked it. But then I was left in the hole. I was like, what the hell does that even mean? So in this talk, I'm going to try to unpack all those words and hopefully prove that it's not just jargon and nonsense. So if that's okay by you, that's what I'm going to do in my talk here. So let's start with platforms. This is called the Platform Summit. Am I right? There's not even a mention of the acronym API in the title of the event. So what is a platform? Well, there's an expert that's been looking into this recently, Melanie Gabriel, and in a big study, she interviewed a bunch of platform economy experts and API economy experts on this very topic. And what she describes a platform, she uses these words. It's a successful platform solve the chicken and egg problem. Platforms leverage network effects. And essentially, in one of her presentations, she uses these 2 models to kind of compare the difference between a traditional pipe model and a platform model, in which this traditional pipe model would involve a single producer creating a single artifact in which a consumer would be creating value from consuming that artifact. So it's a very one-directional kind of channel here. Whereas in a platform model, you're having both the producer and the consumer contributing to something. And both the producer and consumer are hopefully garnering value from that platform. So I'd say that's the main difference and main defining fact of a platform is that there's a collaboration aspect between the consumer and the provider. One way to describe this is just allowing makers to make. And that's something that Jason Woosley said he helped build the Magento platform, which is now with Adobe. And that has spawned a huge developer network just from that kind of platform collaborative mindset. So we know what a platform is, great. How about API? Lately, if I ever meet anyone at a party, I just kind of nod and say, yes, APIs are some sort of beer thing, because it's just become nonsense. And all these providers now are just making things worse, right? API IPAs, there's about 5 of these now that have been brewed. So it's just making the distinction between that a little worse and harder on people like us. But it's all right, and at the end of the day, I can explain it and hopefully come across the fact that APIs are this platform enabler. It's enabling businesses to achieve more and allow developers to integrate and participate in that collaborative platform economy. One way to define an API platform, Travis and some folks back in 2014 actually wrote this up on the Nordic APIs blog. And essentially a platform is one in which the API enables access to the organization's core value proposition. So it's very important to accelerating the business at large. The API is technically and non-technically scalable. So it's not just siloed in this one thing. It's able to grow and able to combine with many other elements. 3, it enables consumers to create shared value. So kind of going back to that platform model I was talking about, there's a shared value if you're an API platform. Next, it would be instrumental in securing the organization's position as a market leader. So if that's a true fact, then it means that hopefully the top management is seeing the API as business critical. So this is how we defined it in 2014, and I think these elements are still pretty viable today. So if you're doing all this kind of stuff in your business, and I assume a lot of us are doing that today, then you can proudly call yourself an API platform. And while we're on the subject of APIs, well, I'll just be the first to quote Programmable Web at an API conference. Sorry, other speakers who might have this planned. But for those of you who don't know, Programmable Web is probably the largest directory of APIs out there, and it's been cataloging the space for quite some time now. And so now we're at 20,000 public APIs. So those are APIs that they've discovered and listed in this directory. And that doesn't even include partner models and private models. This is just purely public, open-facing APIs. So there could be a lot more under the hood that we don't even see. Recently, in a study performed by Cloud Elements in their 2019 State of API Integration report, they found that 55% of businesses use APIs as a revenue stream. So it seems like that whole platform model is working, and executives are considering APIs as core to the value proposition for their companies. And once we start to think of APIs as very valuable, they become productized. And in order to enable an API as a product, we have to think about things like developer experience, because then the developer is that core user that we must cater to with great documentation, making things nicely designed, using the right kind of responses and languages that those developers will be comfortable with, having things like great discoverability for those services, error handling, and the list goes on. And I hope that Nordic APIs has played a part in sharing knowledge when it comes to developer experience and some insights on how to actually productize an API. So this is all great, and I think it's been revolutionary for kind of changing the way we view APIs from just a technical component to something that is more productized. But I do want to kind of step back and reiterate that monetizing something is only one of the many benefits from having an API. And I kind of think there's more on the more indirect side. So let's break this apart. Let's see what we mean by that. If we look at direct monetization or API as a product, we could find things like coin-operated APIs in which you're paying for a certain amount per call. You could view things as an upsell, right? So there's a lot of platforms that are selling an API alongside of a larger platform ecosystem, and the API is then positioned in some sort of upsell to a higher tier. So that's one way it could be directly monetized. Another, I see a lot of APIs being used in affiliate marketing and revenue share agreements with companies in which you might get a split percentage. So there's a lot of ways to productize APIs. But on the converse side, there's many more indirect benefits, I think. APIs are being used in many digital transformation efforts right now across the board. When I first came across digital transformation, I was like, that sounds so 90s, early 2000s, but it's still happening, and a lot of these old incumbents are still transforming, and APIs are being a huge element in that. APIs can be used as a research and development tool. Developers might innovate differently with your API than you might not have assumed in the first place. You might discover some new aspects or potential functionalities as a provider with the head in the woods that you might not see. APIs, when we're talking about indirect benefits, could also benefit from partner and network growth effects. For example, Airbnb just debuted a partner API after being pretty silent with the API economy, at least from a public viewpoint, for quite some time. And that makes a lot of sense for them, because if you think of it from the vantage point of a listing service, they want as many listings as possible. They want to grow their community. They want that high network growth. So enabling a realtor, for example, that has thousands of listings to programmatically add all those listings via a partner API makes a lot of sense. And I wouldn't really call that a direct monetization. That seems pretty indirect because they're not charging for those API calls that I know of, at least. I'm assuming that it's some sort of partner handshake agreement. But there's plenty of other examples outside of Airbnb for that. APIs are also being utilized in a lot of standardization efforts across the board, all over the world. We see that happening with PSD2. APIs are being utilized in banking initiatives to meet those new data sharing requirements. We're also seeing that in the US with things like FHIR network that is established for healthcare and some other initiatives. I would also say that APIs bring a great indirect benefit to marketing. If you're having open data, trying to build a community, spread your brand, there's a lot of great indirect benefits that come from APIs if we think of it from a marketing perspective. So lesson is that API as a product is a great mentality to think of across the board. But if you're thinking of it from a business standpoint and monetization standpoint, there's plenty of other factors to consider. And my clicker is not clicking. All right, so we've discovered that API platforms need strategy. And it looks like we've actually covered both API and strategy from those last few slides, so we're doing pretty well here. Let's think about continuous. Where does that come into play within the current state of digital economies and the API space? Well, I would argue right now that there are so many high expectations for platforms right now. People are expecting extremely high performance, high speed. Users expect reliability, scalability of their services, and it's forcing a lot of different architectural changes across the board, making things more granular. In other words, platforms are sweating, right? The end user expects a lot, as I said, and this is leading a lot of digital transformation initiatives across the board. The average user is spending their time on so many devices. You have your handheld devices, but new things like IoT-enabled voice assistants are making things even more complex. Users expect that same kind of experience and ease of use across the board. Even for resource-heavy things like video sharing or online gaming, which a lot of that is API-driven, and it's going to be interesting to see when games are just processed over the cloud with remote processing. With all that, users still expect their data to be private, and we've seen so much of that in the news lately that it's really changing how these companies need to react. So digital transformation is still alive. The users are driving a lot of that. You don't need to look farther than banking to see the influence that users have, right? So American Banker recently said that 87% of individuals preferred to adopt a fintech application rather than use a product or service offered by a traditional financial services provider. So just one example of how consumer selection is really directing change, and that's affecting how banks are architected and how they're going to become, more software as a service based in response. So in response, software architecture is changing quite rapidly in response to these new user expectations. We've heard a lot about decomposing the monolith into microservices. I still haven't seen a great model of how to do that successfully across any company, but there's a lot of chatter about that. Come to me and let's talk about that, I'm curious. But the whole idea is that this new architecture is based around API integrations, so that's where we are. But in that process, software release has been changing drastically lately as well. Things are becoming more continuous, more iterative. Development cycles are shrinking. Things are becoming more cloud native, and companies are relying on things like serverless and like I said, very quick development cycles. In this new era of software release, continuous delivery is really king. Forbes recently said that companies that win today realize they must ditch legacy systems and embrace more agile, continuous delivery processes. And this is inspiring a whole number of new development trends, which has been fascinating to follow and a little bit difficult with every new description every day. Things like event-driven services and service meshes and new container orchestration services like Istio or Kubernetes coming out every day. I would argue that with all this new development trends that we're seeing, it does require a healthy amount of DevOps. And I don't use that term lightly. I know that it's a little vague and everyone kind of has their own interpretation of what DevOps means to their company. And I've been looking into this recently and interviewing some experts on the subject of DevOps. And I'm kind of thinking like to technically implement it, you do require API strategy, at least when we're talking about the tooling involved with DevOps. So APIs provide the logistics that make DevOps possible within companies. So that's kind of what I want to talk about for the remainder of my talk. But first off, let's see how we're doing with the whole title here. Looks like we covered continuous, so happy about that. And you know what? I'm just going to check off integrated because if you're providing an API, if you're involved in APIs, you're, by facto involved in integrations. So like I said, here's my theory. APIs enable a fully realized DevOps. And perhaps vice versa too, DevOps can use something from the API space and API strategy. So what I want to do here is to first off define this general term of DevOps, see what that means to us. Next, to show some examples of how APIs can actually enable DevOps in practice, hopefully showing some practical examples of that. Demonstrate some benefits, and then do the spin if time allows. We'll see what that means later. So what exactly is DevOps? Well, when I peruse articles and interview some experts in the field, I keep coming back to this idea of de-siloing development and operations. I think that's pretty obvious from the squishing of the name right there. But it's a little bit more than that. I think it's more about transparency and collaboration between teams and giving some tooling and some new networks to allow that to be possible. So when we're talking about new types of tooling, especially in these continuous iterative development cycles, that's relying on a lot of infrastructure as code. You might have seen this term being used around the space. At least to me, that means we're using more reusable software components that can be repurposed along something like a continuous integration pipeline, in which we're going to be needing a lot of different API connections to automate certain things. So from a tooling perspective, that's some interpretations on what is DevOps. But I think DevOps should also be measurable, right? Because we need to iterate quickly. We need to learn about what our development trends are producing and then use that to garner feedback throughout the development cycle. So we need good metrics and statistics if DevOps is going to be working out well. But also, lastly, I've heard it being described as more of a culture rather than a role. Because if you just have one DevOps engineer who thinks this is really cool and wants to implement all this, it's going to be hard to convince an entire company to do that, right? You kind of need company-wide buy-in to make this possible. So a lot of people describe DevOps as a culture as opposed to just a single role. Brandon Pulsifer of Adobe recently described DevOps, core DevOps tenets, as cross-functional accountability, autonomous teams, automation, measurable progress, and lean iterations. So that's kind of where I'm getting some of the inspiration from this talk from. And if we go to automation, the kind of ideal end goal with this DevOps is to have this iterative cycle, to have some sort of continuous delivery pipeline in which you might be automating some build from this push, which then compiles something, compiles a Docker build in a container, and then runs some sort of some tests against that, and then hopefully can deploy if the tests do pass. So that's an example pipeline by Semaphore CI right there. Kem L. Brader also defines DevOps as the consolidation of process and configuration into code and the execution of the automated build, testing, validation, and release through a continuous integration pipeline. So if we're talking about that, there's a lot of tech that seems like would be involved in this whole process. We're talking about some sort of pipeline that needs to be constructed, the scripts that must be called along that way, these sort of auto tests or scanning for certain vulnerabilities in containers that needs to be applied throughout a continuous development process, and more, right? There's a lot of tech to consider if we're actually going to implement this. So I always come back to APIs, really, if I'm going to think of a logistical answer to this. I think APIs must drive DevOps if we're going to be implementing these philosophies in real life. Christopher Sandoval, a prolific writer for Nordic APIs, once wrote that we often look at APIs only in one light. We view them as a product rather than what they are, which is a core enabling system for the modern code infrastructure. So it's kind of what I was talking about with the whole platform economy description earlier. And he goes on to say that APIs are involved in nearly every action in the DevOps space. So some examples of that. Let's dig into some brief examples here to see if APIs can help development and operations. Skim is an interesting standard that we recently covered on the blog, and the security guys know a lot about that, but I think it could be automated within some sort of operational process to automate user creations or retrieve user data. Things like batch requests on a whole number of users can be utilized using the Skim API. So that's one example of a programmatically API-driven operational tool. Container operations can be easily utilized with something like the Docker API. You know, we can call the Docker API to run a container, print logs of a specific container, and more, right? So this just enhances automation for an enterprise and could offer some extensibility for custom apps that you're building to help progress the development pipeline internally. Another example could be retrieving information from the Kubernetes API. Offers a REST API to interact with pods and clusters and resources. So you could go beyond just a basic read to actually perform some write capabilities for even greater technical use. Things like spinning up a new server, that can all be API driven. Something I'm really interested in is this concept of chat ops, and I don't know how feasible it is and how many people are implementing it, but it's a pretty cool idea, right? Having the ability to do things like building, testing, and deploying just from a chat interface like Slack. And I would imagine that something like this requires so many API connections to function correctly, as these powers and YAML scripts that are created to initiate this sort of functionality really tie into APIs. If we're thinking about this from a DevOps angle, this is interesting to me because it's improving transparency across teams and allowing everyone to see what exactly is going on with development and operations from a single chat interface. So that's pretty interesting. Just a very simple diagram of what might be happening in a fundamental chat ops approach. If we're talking about the DevOps team initiating some sort of functionality in a chat app, usually a bot is constructed to then utilize that sort of natural language to initiate infrastructure on the back end. So I think that's cool, and we've also seen some progress toward natural language APIs, which we've talked about at some other Nordic APIs conferences. So in conclusion, we are seeing a lot of high consumer expectations beckoning change. We've seen how a platform model really helps with new digital transformation efforts. I do believe that DevOps is necessary to achieve some of this. Perhaps it's not the end-all, be-all, but it's part of the equation. I believe that APIs are making DevOps goals possible. And really, APIs and DevOps should be friends. So that's my talk. If you leave here with anything, just remember APIs are core to automation, as we saw through the whole continuous integration build cycles and such. API-first designs are improving development and interoperability standards for today's most powerful digital platforms. So I'm going to spin it around. What does a continuous API strategy mean to you? Because I think this could have multiple different understandings. So please come talk to me throughout the conference. Let's share insights. So thank you for listening. My slides should have just gone up to my Twitter. They're also at my SlideShare right there. As Travis was mentioning in the introduction, our blog is very open. I love learning from the community and sharing your stories on this channel. So please consider submitting that. We welcome community submissions. There's my email. Yeah, like Travis mentioned, I also operate a newsletter for Nordic APIs, and to get these sort of information packets in our digest, you can sign up right there. And yeah, just leave my contact right there. I think that's all I have for you. Yeah, thank you for having me.